its board of directors.
Good afternoon. I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to The Conversation with Al McFarlane. Today is Tuesday, May 2nd, 2023. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along. What a gorgeous day it is here in Minnesota. And I hope it's the same for you anywhere, everywhere around the community, around the world. Got a great show today. My guests include KRISTIN Henning, who is the author of The Rage of Innocence, talking about children accused of crime. It's going to be a great conversation. And my guests include Kathleen Allen of Allen and Associates. She's also written a piece called The Power of Independence. We'll get into that in a minute as well. Finally, we want to remind you, not finally, but first, before we start, remind you that we appreciate your support, appreciate you being here on KFAI radio, but also on the various social media platforms that we're on. And what we are asking is that you support our initiative to grow our subscriber base. How do you do that? Get a minute, take a minute, go to YouTube, Insight News, subscribe. No cost, no charge, easy to do. We want to get 1,000 subscribers, and we need each of you, need you individually to do what you can. And what you can do is go to YouTube, Insight News, and subscribe. We thank you for your listening, your support. We also want you to be involved in the conversation. No matter the platform, there's always a chat or a comment section. We're monitoring Facebook, we're monitoring LinkedIn and YouTube. And if you got a comment, drop it in there. We want to share your comment, shout you out. In fact, we'd love to know where you're listening from. So join us by, help us by saying who you are and where you are, and we'll acknowledge you. Well, we want to start, as we always do, with what we call hot topics, and reminding you all that May is Asian American and Pacific Island Heritage Month. This is an annual celebration that recognizes the historical and cultural contributions of individuals and groups of Asian and Pacific Islander descent here in the U.S. So the AAPI umbrella term includes cultures from the entire Asian continent, including East, Southeast, and South Asia, and the Pacific Islands of Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have contributed significantly to many facets of American culture and society, including science, obviously, and medicine, literature and art, sports and recreation, government and politics and activism and law. In 2021, Kamala Harris became the first Asian American Vice President of the United States. The effort to officially recognize Asian American and Pacific Islander contributions to the U.S. began in the late 70s, and it took over 10 years to make it a permanent month-long celebration. We here at Insight News and at The Conversation with Al McFarlane are thrilled to honor Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. You know, I was at my barber this Saturday, getting my regular haircut, and cup and classic barbershop banter talk. Some guys came in, and I mean, going to a barbershop was like going to the OK Corral. You go in ready to see who you're going to be sparring with. And brother and his son came in, and for no reason, I said, you know what? Why is it Europe? And why is it not Western Asia? I mean, what defines a continent? And does the idea of Europe fit that definition? I thought was always surrounded by a body of water. Europe is not. And so I raised the question today, why is it Europe? Why is it not Western Asia? Think about it. So the second hot topic today, important here in Minnesota, important in the country. Minnesota Senate passed a marijuana legalization bill. That's going to be heading to final discussions between the Senate and the House. The governor has said he will sign the bill when it comes to his desk. So in a major sign of momentum for legalization of adult use marijuana, the Minnesota State Senate last Friday approved a bill that sets up a structure for growing and selling cannabis while revisiting convictions for past drug crimes. Lead sponsor Lindsay Port of Burnsville said Minnesotans are ready. Attitudes are changing. Now is our time to undo decades of ineffective and damaging prohibition of marijuana. So it was a 34 to 33 party line vote that sent the bill into final negotiations with the Minnesota House, which had passed a different version on Tuesday. If those talks lead to a merged bill, new votes will be needed to send it to Governor Tim Walz, who's a Democratic governor. He has promised that he will sign it. We'll keep you informed as the bill makes its way into law. In the meantime, I want to know your thoughts on legalization of marijuana. And tell me, what's the status of legalized marijuana in your state? One of the things I'll be doing is reaching out to Black people in particular who are in the marijuana business or marijuana adjacent businesses, or in government agencies that have been responsible for prosecuting and arresting people on marijuana based crimes. Let's have this discussion on how we position ourselves as a community as the society thinks differently about marijuana. Well, again, thank you so much for being here. I want to begin the program by bringing in Kris Henning. Kris Henning is joining me, I think, from Washington, D.C. or from the East Coast. Washington, right? Kris, good afternoon. Right. How you doing?
I'm great. How are you? Thank you for having me, Al.
Well, thank you for being here. I am great as well. You have been working to support children, representing juveniles. You've got well, tell me, what is the Rage of Innocence? What's it about? And how did you come to write this book?
So indeed, I have a book called The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And it really is all about the ways in which Black youth have been denied, quite frankly, the privilege of being an adolescent, right? Of being a child. It is about the fact that I am a defense attorney and I have been representing children for the last 26 years. And in that entire 26 years, I have only represented 4 white children in the nation's capital. And all of us should be appalled. We should gasp at that statistic. For those of you who aren't, from DC, you might be thinking, well, maybe there aren't any white kids in the nation's capital, or white kids don't commit crime. And I think we know that's just simply not the case, right? And so we have to ask ourselves, why is it that so many Black and brown children end up or disproportionately overrepresented in the juvenile legal system? And so that's really what this book is about. It really grapples with some of those hard questions, why the extreme racial disparities exist. Another critical question that this book seeks to answer is, what impact does that criminalization, this disparate treatment of Black and brown children during their adolescence, what kind of impact does that have on their development, their mental health, their physical health, all the things that we care about? And then what can we as a society do about it? And so it's a collection of stories written for, everyday readers. The idea is I want you to see yourself in one of these stories, things that you did when you were a kid and you came out just fine without police intervention or incarceration, expulsion from school. And so I want us to think differently and creatively outside the box about how we intervene on behalf of young people.
I'm Al McFarlane. You're listening to The Conversation with Al McFarlane, my guest, Kris Henning. She's an attorney in the DC area, and she's written a book. The book is called The Rage of Innocence, and it talks about how we have traumatized children. Well, you mentioned this, Kris. Let me ask you to follow up. What are the factors? Would you describe some of the factors that disproportionately put youth of color into the criminal justice system, Black children in particular. You know, and I am surprised, but I'm not surprised when you tell me that over your career, you've only represented 4 white kids. Doesn't surprise me at all. It made me think of, this is tangential, but systemic. It made me think about how systems like adoption and foster care
Mhm.
work, where it seems to me too often Black children end up adopted in white families, but Black families are not able to avail themselves of the resources. Uh, it's a stretch here in the train of thought that I'm making, but let me come back to the original question. What are the factors that disproportionately put Black children, Black youth in the criminal justice system?
Well, there are, a range of them. I mean, I think when we think about the sources, right, of referral to the juvenile legal system, one is schools, right? So the fact that police are disproportionately present in
Mm-hmm.
schools that have a higher percentage of Black and brown children, right? So just proximity, the ways in which we rely on traditional law enforcement responses to respond to the needs, the discipline, the support, in an effort almost even to provide support for children, we rely on police to do that in schools. And so that's one question. It's one source, the school to prison pipeline. And also thinking about youth in schools with disabilities, and Black and brown youth in schools when they have a disability are significantly more likely to be referred out of school to traditional law enforcement response, meaning being arrested at school, disciplined at school, through out of school suspension, instead of getting in school mental health supports, extra tutoring, smaller class sizes, restorative justice, social emotional learning, all of the alternatives to punitive interventions with folks. And so, you're asking, what are some of the sources? School to prison pipeline. Another source is truly the ways in which bias operates in our society. There's research demonstrating that individuals, both civilians and police officers, tend to perceive Black males, for example,
Mm-hmm.
as significantly older than they actually are, more than 4.5 years, in fact, older than they actually are. So you think about 12-year-old Tamir Rice, right?
Mm-hmm.
From, Cleveland, Ohio, who was shot dead in less than 3 seconds of officers seeing him, with a toy gun in a park. They immediately in interviews talked about how they thought he was older than he actually was. So if this research is right, he's being perceived as, 16, 17, year old instead of a 12-year-old. But think about the 17-year-old Black boys that get referred from schools or get stopped in the community. Those kids are being perceived as an adult before they even have, their adolescent brain formulated, right? So there's that. I also should note for you, Al, that, I imagine some of your listeners are thinking, but, crime is going up right now and we've got to, buckle down. But the reality is, yes, any one crime by any one child is sad. It's it's a problem for all of us in the society, but we have to think about the larger ecosystem. What is going on in our society that is contributing to that, right? That is leading children to that path, right? So thinking about what we can do better in schools and communities and mental health and vocation, all of those things are absolutely critical. The other thing that folks have to remember is, notwithstanding what we see on the news and in the media and how tragic crime is for victims, that we also have to be careful not to criminalize the whole for the sins of the 2% or the 3%. And the data is clear that very few young people of any race and any class are involved in the types of serious violent offenses that we hear most about on the media. And that makes us afraid. That doesn't mean those things aren't happening. It just means that they are not the totality, and that we have to be careful about how we build policy on those high profile cases, as opposed to doing what we know works, especially when we're doing so in ways that are disproportionately harming Black and brown children.
So how do we create formations within the Black community that, number one, reflect our sense of dignity, our humanity, our desire for justice, our bid to reflect and bring, you know, uh, ethical behavior, ethically based relationships into the world. I think that most of us try to live by, but we also are living within a cocoon, a system that consistently and persistently denigrates, devalues, degrades, and tells itself that our humanity is suspect, and therefore authorizes the abuse of our culture, our people, as business as usual. How do we respond to that? What do we do to both protect ourselves, our families, our children, and neighborhoods, to hold both ourselves and our children responsible and accountable, and at the same time recognize that we're in a double bind,
Right.
because a failure is a failure, and I don't want my child to fail. My parents didn't want me to fail, right? They were genuine in their intent to try to raise a decent human being. And I think that that's a very ordinary description of what it is to be a Black person, a Black parent, or a parent, right?
That's
And
right.
so when any of us does fail, what is the responsibility of all of us to address the failure, to minimize the damage and the impact, but also to be part of healing and restoration? Is healing and restoration, are they part of what our response should be? Has that been the case in our society? That's a big question. I'm gonna, I'm gonna put it back to you,
Yeah.
Attorney Chris Henning.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's a beautiful question. I love your framing. It's a double bind, right? And so there are, I think, a few things that I hear, weaving through your question, and one of which is, we. I want to be clear when I talk about, crime and the criminalization of Black youth. I want to be safe too. I'm a Black woman. I want to be safe. I want all the children, that I love and care about to be safe. I want my family, my community to be safe. But the question is, we as a Black community have to come together and get some agreement about, well, what's the best path towards that, and how do we insist upon that in society. And so when I think about we as a Black community, you will often hear Black communities talking about how we need more police. We need more law enforcement responses for these children who have run amok and who are terrorizing our community. And in part, that response is a natural human response, but it's also because we as a people, like all Americans, have been conditioned to believe that the only way to ensure school safety and to ensure public safety is through traditional law enforcement responses, right? And so if you give me one option, I want to stay safe, and you give me only one option, you agree to fund, policing in my community, then I'm going to take it in order to be safe. But if we really as a community, engage in conversations like that you and I are having, Al, and understand what the alternatives are, and we as a Black community go and say, we demand more. Right? We demand more than just police in schools. We demand more than just, surveillance in our communities. What we demand is, again, vocational opportunities, better schooling, better housing, right? A continuum of mental health services that are not stigmatizing to children. It's all of that, right? We demand recreation and play, for children, opportunities for my kid to go out and play in whatever way he wants to play without being, threatened by the state, not just by other kids, but also by the state, right? So we need all of that, and we need to demand that. Whenever a high-profile incident, occurs, we all want to jump up and we join. Yes, send more police to me, and I'm urging us to resist that, right? I also want us as a Black community. You talked about when individual harm happens, and you called it a fail, right? And it is a fail, but the question is, who fails? I mean, I've heard people talk about there was an 8-year-old, who shot a teacher. That was beyond tragic, right? And I struggle. I'm just going to be brutally honest with you. I struggle to blame that child for that. Yes, that child took that action and that was very, very harmful, but that blame and that, who do we situate, that comes way before this child, came into this world. And certainly this is a child who could not have been getting the support he needs in any of the sectors of his life. And so we are quick to blame, the child, but I want us to think about the definition of victim. There were multiple victims in that story, right? That kid was certainly one of the victims, as well as any teacher and other school officials and other kids who were traumatized and shot in that moment. So I want us to understand that. So healing also requires understanding, and understanding of the full picture of the truth of the whole ecosystem, and not just the one we like to call the perpetrator, the victim. He's not the only fail. And in fact, he's not the fail. It's all of us as a people, as a system, have failed. And I think that we have to be careful about labeling. And then the final thing I think I'll say to what your question asks is about what do we do around healing, right? One of the words I use often is grace. And that's grace for everybody, right? All of us making mistakes as adults in working with children, but grace for the children themselves who make the mistakes. And that what we, each and every one of us, needs to do is to be, well, actually, I'll say it this way. A psychologist friend taught me that every single child deserves and needs at least one irrationally caring adult in their life. And then I take that further and say every child would do better with a team of irrationally caring adults. That's a group of adults who understand that kids are kids. They make mistakes. Sometimes mistakes have serious consequences, but we don't shame them. We don't humiliate them. We don't bury them under jails. We don't label them. Instead, we support, we guide, and redirect them. And so I ask all of us to think about, what can you do to be that irrationally caring adult, not just for your own children, but for some other kid in your community?
I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. My guest, KRISTIN Henning, an attorney in the Washington, D.C. area. She's got a book that you need to read. The book is entitled The Rage of Innocence, and it's about how we disproportionately find youth of color in the criminal justice system. And I want to end the conversation, Chris, with you talking about what we can do to help or change this moving forward. But I'm going to take us in the deep water before I do that. Okay, so go with me on this. In the past several days, we've done a couple of hot topics and discussions about recently Minnesota's Attorney General, Keith Ellison, black guy, neighbor of mine, a friend of mine, asked the governor to take a case from the Hennepin County attorney. The case involved two black youths. One was 15, one 16, and an older person, maybe in his 20s. The older person purchased a gun, gave it to the two young boys, drove them to the home of his former girlfriend with the instruction to go in, apparently, and kill her. That's what they did. They shot. So the 15-year-old, according to the papers, actually pulled the trigger, shot the woman 5 times in front of her infant child. So the county attorney, I think, in a sense of being progressive and compassionate, was weighing, how do I redeem this 15-year-old, and how do I, maybe have him dealt with in juvenile system with something over his head to regulate his behavior as an adult in the future. The attorney general stepped in and said, no, this was so heinous, so egregious, that we got to do something different, and we got to do more. And so the potential plea deal was struck down, and now this young man, as I understand it, is going to be tried as an adult. The family felt some relief because they felt their daughter, sister, that life was not being valued, and they were enraged and in suffering and pain at the cruelty visited on this young woman. They feel some relief that they're being heard, listened to. So what do we do? And the question I had for my friends in the barbershop, this was another barbershop discussion. What do we do? And I call this a failure. The question is, if the 24-year-old had kind of mind control over these kids, the 15 to 16-year-old, does the blame go with, or the weight go on the 24-year-old, or on the young people that did the shooting, or on all three? How do you weigh that? How does the community weigh that? That's my question. I'll end with this. I wrote a piece some years ago and provided testimony at the state legislature. In reading this piece, the piece was called Black Crime, Black Punishment. And the concept was this: if we, the idea of sovereignty in our community, in our neighborhood, has to extend to the idea that the machinery of justice we must own as well. Meaning we have to be the police department. I think this is maybe true in your city. We have to be the judges. We have to be the probation officers. We have to be the food service contractors and the construction companies that build detention halls and schools and other places where life and community, society are regulated. But it means putting our whole community in a space of equity, accountability, and responsibility. And that place also involves all of the revenue streams associated with creating a civil society. And too often, however, I claimed, we get the misery, they get the money. Our failure, our displacement becomes a revenue stream for white people. I'll leave it there. You can respond.
Yeah, I have to say, so many things run through my mind. The first thing is, with your question, my heart goes out to the victim and the victim's family. That woman who lost her life so tragically and violently. The conversation has to start there. And I want so much for them to have some restoration, some recognition, excuse me, that was a valued life. So that, excuse me, I so apologize. But the second thing is, excuse me, is also that my heart, I don't know if my heart, but my empathy, excuse me, lies with the Attorney General, who also has to make a decision right in the moment like this. And I think we as a society, we get too caught up in believing that we are comparing apples to apples, one victim to another victim. And that if you don't lay down the gauntlet for this crime, then you don't value my daughter, my mother, my sister. And that's not at all how the criminal justice system works. That's not how restorative justice works at all. There is nothing, and I feel bad thinking about it. I've lost people in my family too, but there is really nothing that can bring back that loss.
That's right.
For that person. There's nothing, right? And so punishing that child as an adult, punishing that child with the death penalty does not bring back that life. And so, but I get it at the deep emotional level. I understand why people want that deep retribution. But what I think I beg society to do is to figure out, like, how do we restore harm? How do we prevent this in the future? Those are the critical questions, right? And how do we restore victims is thinking about ways that society owes that family an apology. Finding ways that society can honor that woman who lost her life, right? Through storytelling, through, ceremony, through family support, right? Pouring into that family. That's how society shows that they are sorry. It is also about restorative justice for that child, teaching the child what that harm is, helping that adolescent get to a place, right, where that adolescent learns how to say, I'm sorry. But I got to tell you that doesn't come from putting them in an adult prison, right, where they are literally terrified and terrorized by adults in that space. Can you imagine 15-year-old in an adult prison, subject to sexual abuse, physical abuse, lack of education? And guess what? Even when they get sent to adult prison, they eventually get out, right? They get out. And so what are we doing to society? And so that, I think, and so when I talk about having some level of empathy for your friend, Keith Ellison, and having to make a decision like that, my empathy only goes so far, because we know what works and we know what's harmful. And so it takes a severe and extreme, I'll use that word, extreme act of courage in the face of the pain of that victim's family that we can all relate to stand up and say, but yet and still, I'm going to do right by what I know from the science about how to best intervene in the lives of adolescents. Okay. So, excuse me. So that's what I urge Allison to do. I'm so sorry, you guys. I hope you can hear me. And so
we do.
When I think
Listen,
about,
thank you.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
No. So when I think
ahead.
about equity and accountability, that's the other thing, right? So doing what's right based on the science, what works for adolescents, but it's also equity and accountability. And the fact that I know, Cal Rittenhouse's scenario was very different, but we have to think about the number of children who don't look like, Black children, right? And the ways in which we have figured out, right, how to understand and how to engage them as adolescents, even when they do terrible, terrible things. Okay. And so Cal Rittenhouse ended up taking the lives of two people, severely injuring, paralyzing another, and yet and still he got a full and fair trial. And, he ultimately was treated as an adult, but that's only because of state law, right? That he was of age to be presumptively treated as an adult, but he got a full and fair trial, and the whole world, right? Or at least, his jury and many, many people who reported on it understood him as an adolescent who got in over his head and who was manipulated by, these societal thinkings, right? And we don't ever give that grace. We don't ever accept and apply what we know about adolescent development to Black and brown children. And so that's my pieces that I would say there. So I wish Ellison had not taken hold of that case. And
Okay, let's go. I'll let him know. Interesting. Listen, this is such a wonderful conversation. Let me say hello to Deborah White, DJ, listening from Minnetonka, Minnesota. And also I see my good friend, Louis Alamayu, one of the great thinkers, great spirits, ancestor worship here, saying that our relationship to one another as Black people, manifesting community is essential. And thanks for what we're doing in this conversation. Thanks to Mary Milner and also Michelle Madison. Thank you for letting us know that you're there. And wherever you are, we appreciate your listening, your participation. Send us a note. Let us know where you are and let us know your thoughts on the topic. Chris Henning, thank you so much. Hang around if you can, because I've got another great interview. And I think what I want to do is bring all of us together at the end of it and have some parting comments. So I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. My next guest is Dr. Kathleen Allen. And Kathleen, thank you for joining the program today. You have a piece called Leading from the Roots. What's Leading from the Roots about?
Well, I wrote this book because I love nature and I'm a big gardener, and I relate to the ideas and the way I feel when I am connected to nature. So, but I'm an organizational consultant. I do leadership coaching for executives that are engaged in large change work in their organizations. And I was lucky enough to work with people who were pushing the envelope on how to work with people in organizations. And we started experimenting together about what would happen if we treated our employees not as commodities, not as objects to be used and discarded, but as living human beings who, in a living system. And nature is a living system. It's dynamic. It's always changing, but it's not changing for change's sake. It's changing to evolve, to get better, to become more complex, more interconnected, more interdependent. And so I just love these ideas, and they inspired me to change the way I was leading and helping other people to lead change in organizations. So Leading from the Roots really looks to nature, which is a complex, interdependent, system, dynamic system that is for today's world is a much better model for us to learn how to be in organizations than what we've been taught, which is to create these hierarchies filled with command and control structures and processes and things like
Well,
that.
let's talk about hierarchy, first of all, and talk about patriarchy in particular. You know, and I guess I want to get a sense of how you assemble the world. You are paying homage to, the beauty, the organic power, beauty, genius of nature itself. And I
Mhm.
take that to mean of creation. If I'm stepping out of my lane, let me know. But I'm feeling that you're talking about the entire apparatus as a thing of beauty, and
Is-
that somehow we got to figure out how to pay attention to it and connect with it and see ourselves as part of it, as opposed to seeing ourselves as in spite of it or against it. Uh, how do you see us organized as human beings right now? And are there different models, different strategies? Are there strategies that will move us towards what you find inspiring in studying and reflecting the genius, the healing power of nature itself? What do you think?
So I think right now
Is the question okay? First of all,
yeah, absolutely. I think right now we're living in a system, a hierarchical system that is actually designed to exploit and extract uh, natural resources and human resources. And the benefits and the burdens of the system are not equally shared. So what we have is a system that's designed with the purpose of the enclosure of wealth and power. And it's based in a worldview of separation, that I am autonomous and separate from each other. And the power of interdependence is a deeply embedded design in nature. And so as a result, if everything's connected, it changes everything about how we show up in the world and also how we think about solving problems and how we think about structuring our problems. And if we really saw our relationships and our interconnection and our interdependence like nature does, our purpose of our economic systems would be to ensure the well-being of social well-being and environmental well-being. So we would have a different purpose. It wouldn't be about enclosing wealth and power. It would be about what is good for the whole community. I could really relate to Chris's comments because she's working upstream against a culture that is fundamentally has an overstory of separation. And when you have an overstory of separation, then doing something to someone is an obvious thing. But if you think about interdependence, you would have to ask the question, how am I contributing to the problem that I'm currently trying to solve? Because it's all connected. That's a very different orientation. But we have legal systems and laws on our books that reinforce separation. We have an economic structure that is all about separation. We're doing the same thing to nature. And so what's interesting about nature and climate is they're taking us to school on interdependence. So
explain that.
Well, every major crazy weather event that we've been experiencing is a feedback loop from nature that says, pay attention. The way you're showing up in the world is putting nature and the system of nature out of balance. Nature has 3.8 billion years of research and development on how to create a system that regenerates. Think about that. We've had 5 mass extinctions.
Considerably more than we have as human beings.
Yeah,
in our present configuration.
Yeah, but they regenerate each time. So life is still here. So that means that the design works. So, nature's principles for the deep design of nature, waste is not wasted. It's always becomes food for something else. There's a nursing log that looks like it's just disintegrating in nature, but it becomes food for a whole ecology of small beings and even places where trees can root over the nursing log and get enough substance to grow up tall. We have nature rewards cooperation because it sees interdependence. Nature banks on diversity because as the system evolves and becomes more complex, it becomes more diverse and it becomes more generous, which is a really intriguing framework, right? Because the diversity of an ecological system actually creates these mutualistic reinforcing relationships. So they don't have to get all the nutrients from the soil, they can get it from each other as well. And I love those ideas. And I think our organizations would be better if we used those ideas and the way we thought about them and the way we led them.
So how do you deliver an idea like that to a corporation whose mission is extract and exploit and maximize profit? I mean, the principle, the stated goal of the company is of the corporation is shareholder benefit and profit, and the methodology is exploitation and extraction. You extract resources from the environment, minerals from the earth, and you extract the humanity, the lives
Yeah.
of human beings and other animals for the mission of hoarding or enclosing, as you described it, power and money. So when you show up with your message, what are you finding?
Well, I have to say, I'm very lucky because the people that find me and want me to work with them and their organization are the people who are already realizing that the way we're currently doing things isn't working anymore. So I'm not working with the Fortune 100 because they're
Okay.
deeply steeped in this enclosure of power and wealth. And they're actually, I think many of them are fighting hard to try to keep it that way. But the thing is that if the whole world is moving towards interdependence, eventually your orientation of separation is going to collapse underneath you, and you're going to have to explore a new business model. But the people who find me are pressing the envelope on how to be different. A lot of them are young startups, entrepreneurs who really don't want to fall into that kind of hierarchical framework. They're trying to figure out what is a different kind of relationship that we can have with each other and the way we work in our organizations, and also our organization's relationship to the community so that they're living in and growing in. And it just, it changes. So when I go in to work with people, one of the things is that I found is that when you treat people as if they're living human beings, they're much more cooperative about wanting to do something that will be better for the mission and better for everybody in the organization. They actively lean in instead of resist. So that's kind of cool. The second is that if we're all connected, our relationships matter. And the authenticity and the congruence between our inside work and our outside voices and actions helps people see, oh, this person's authentic. They really mean what they say. And it increases trust, it increases cooperation, it diminishes fear, it increases engagement. And then what's interesting, it starts getting people open to difference in all kinds of ways, shapes, and forms. So separation is something that rests more in fear than in possibility. And so when I work with organization, it fundamentally changes both the environment, the emotional tone of the organization, as well as the tasks of what we're trying to do. It unleashes innovation, and it's just really stunning how it changes. And when I go into an organization, I find that just like nature, context matters. So if you don't understand the context and the soil in which people are growing in, if you don't understand that they had a mass firing 5 years ago and the people who are left are still experiencing trauma from that event, you're not going to get anywhere. So I find that the more I understand the context, the specific kind of history and experiences that people have, the better I can be at finding the space, the place to start a shift.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. My guest is Kathleen Allen. Dr. Kathleen Allen, her book, Leading from the Roots, talked about what nature is and how we can use nature to inspire ourselves and our organizations and institutions to both regroup and to reorganize. Dr. Allen, one of the things that caught my attention in your early comments was the notion of nature's capacity at, I think you said,
regenerating. I lost your sound. Okay, so the sound is off from Al. We've lost his sound. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just a few interesting connections in nature. And how because it's interdependence, it changes the way you think about showing up. The first thing that comes to mind are aspen trees. The aspens, when you look at a kind of a gathering of aspen trees coming down the mountainside in Utah, for example, what you don't see is that underneath all of the root structure of the aspen is one organism. So on the surface, everything looks separate and individual, but underneath everything is connected. And I'm thinking that in organizations, what we don't see is because we're looking at things through separation and autonomy. You know, we develop silos, we develop accidental adversarial relationships in our organizations where people are fighting against each other instead of cooperating and working together for the betterment of the organization. A lot of the organizations that I work with are often trying to move from a silo structure to something that's more interconnected. The CEOs that I work with are trying to figure out how can I get the people in the team of my leadership team to think and work together for the purpose of the long-term resilience of the organization. Instead of fighting for their piece of the pie. And so we kind of work through that. And part of the way we work through that is we help people see how they're connected. I often ask leadership teams to think with each other, how do they individually help or hinder their colleagues sitting around the leadership table, how they help or hinder their colleagues' ability to get their work done. And it's a fascinating conversation when you kind of go through and think about this. So aspen trees are helpful. Mycelium in nature is a beautiful concept. It's a fungus that connects plants and trees to each other. And they have three kind of basic functions: connect, inform, and share. So mycelium connects trees to trees, plants to trees, plants to plants. They send information and energy through them, like we're being attacked, build your immune system because we have a beetle coming in, or we have, and they also share resources and nutrients. And when I look at an organization that's heavily siloed, that's one of the things that I ask is, you know, how could we be mycelium? How could we create more sharing, connecting, and information flow in our organizations to make them better? Another kind of framework is that nature has certain design principles. As I said before, waste is not wasted. It taps the power of limits. So we live in Minnesota and we're at zone 3 for gardening. Very cold in the winter. And only certain kinds of life forms will thrive in Minnesota, and they're different than the ecosystems in Florida or in Central America or in the Antarctic. And so life thrives within limits in nature. But human beings, we look at limits and we say, I'm not going to pay attention to you. I'm going to see if I can't extract more money from somebody so I don't have to be innovative and see what would thrive in our place. Allie,
Are you able to hear me now?
I can. Yeah.
Okay, I lost my sound for a second there. Thank you. Let me bring Chris Henning back in. We've got about 10 minutes to finish. I want to just expand the conversation and to see how we all, sort of can play off of each other. This is a great conversation. Thank you so much for being here. And the question I was raising before I think I lost my mic had to do with, I don't know if you heard me say this or not, but I was saying that, in my mind, the notion of the hierarchy and the patriarchy reflect what I perceive to be a male principle way of assembling the world, and that is characterized by a willingness to do violence and a willingness to be extractive and a willingness to hoard and build the enclosure, as you said, it around power and wealth. And I was raising the question, is there a different model? And that what keyed the question was your use of the term regenerative. And what is regenerative in nature that is also expressed in each individual human? That was the question.
Yeah, so if nature were to have a purpose, it would be to create conditions conducive to the life of future generations. And when I listened to Chris, for example, I thought that is a very connected idea to what she's expressing, which is, look at what we're doing. We are not being in relationship to each other. We don't even treat these problems as if we're connected to them. And if we became or took nature's purpose to create conditions conducive to the future of the next generation's life, what would we be doing differently? How would our laws look differently? How would we, I have some clients in Africa, and they were talking about, we were in an organizational conversation, and we were talking about developing our staff. And one of them said, I don't know if you know very much about the culture in Africa. And of course I don't, because I've never been there. But he said, we actually have people in our communities who are assigned to help people move through their personal issues. He didn't use the language of issue. That's a kind of a US language for people, right? But it was like, oh, okay. This is a different way of being in relationship. And they see that and they celebrate it, and they have ways of being in relationship to each other that make it not just an organization's problem to develop somebody, but everybody's problem, because we're connected.
Chris, jump in. What do you think? How does this relate to what you were expressing as a vision of how we ought to be engaged differently?
I just have to say, I so appreciate this conversation and your insights and analogies, Dr. Allen. I mean, several things in your comments resonated with me. This interdependence right off the gate, right? I love this. I agree. I echo what Al said, the regenerative. If we thought ahead about how we are in relationship to one another and how we might have a role to play in the problem that we are attempting to solve, how much better off would we be? That deeply connects to me, resonates also with me, your notion of humanity, right? Interdependence and humanity. If we saw that person, our neighbor, our child, right, as one who, is a human, very much like themselves, right? We're looking for difference and separation instead of connection. So I love all of this. Several other things sort of made me think. I talk often about proximity. And I should say, Brian Stevenson talks about proximity and how important it is for us to understand one another's humanity by being proximate to one another instead of separate from one another. So all of it resonates. And then even when you first started talking about nature, right, I was thinking in a very, very practical way. One of the things when I talk about children, and particularly Black and brown children who are deprived of an opportunity to be children because we criminalize their normal adolescence, we're also criminalizing play, recreation, and leisure, which for me are deeply and integrally tied to nature, right? We don't like, it's so critically important to think about adolescent development as needing physical exercise, needing time to socialize with friends, that fresh air, that vitamin E, all of it, right? But as we sort of destroy, society, hoard resources and power in ways that impact later generations, we're also, depriving Black and brown children of an opportunity to just play and enjoy and cherish nature. And so many Black children and families are afraid to send their children outside because they're afraid of what might happen to them, right? So I just, so much of it resonated. That was my sort of quick summary run through of all that I heard.
Well, so the question for me, Chris and Dr. Kathleen, is where do we go from here? Because I believe that the conversation we're having is really bigger and broader and more widely perceived and understood than we know. And I think it really does reflect how most people on the planet, either with training or with intuition, with feeling, with spirit, are connected to. But the problem is the apparatus of apparati that arrange society discourage and dissuade our knowledge of each other.
Yeah, so
but I think that how do we mobilize, then organize, Dr. Allen?
I think this is a critical time because I think we're actually in what I call a paradigm fight. And right before a paradigm, an old paradigm or an old way of thinking falls, the voices of that old way of thinking get louder and stronger. And the new ways are still there. They're still going to, we're still going to shift, but we're in a place of high degree of kind of tension where the separation language, the autonomous language, your failure does not affect my success, but in an interdependent world, a person who fails, a person who is hurt, will also bounce back on us because we're connected, we're not separate. And so the rise of the language of empathy, the constant feedback from climate change that we're messing with an interdependent system, and people who are denying that are basically saying, I'm separate. I'm not going to go around and mess with this nature system. That's something else is going on there. So I think we're in a fight to help people reconnect. So I think we're in the great reconnection, the great recognition that we're all connected. And that means connected to the earth, connected to each other. This is a very indigenous worldview. The communities that are deeply anchored to the land, they get this because it just shapes their whole worldview and culture. So how do we get back to that? And I think there are all kinds of voices once you open up your eyes and look, like Chris, like you, Al, like myself, who are basically bringing forward an alternative way to think about the world, to think about each other, to think about our communities, our organizations, how we structure them. So I think that that's what our job is to keep these new ideas emerging, to challenge and provoke, to do what we can from where we sit.
Chris, 30 seconds.
Yeah, the quick thing is, as we're thinking about all of these issues, bring in the youth voices, right? And all of these critical questions, critical debates that impact them when we're long gone, we need their voices. Climate control, immigration rights, police in schools, mental health, all of that, they have insights. And so that's, if we're really serious about interdependence, let's hear from them too.
And the organizations, anybody below about 35 already gets interdependence.
Okay, all right. Listen, what a wonderful conversation. Now, thank you both so very much. Kris Henning, the book is The Rage of Innocence. Thank you for being here and talking about that, shedding light on critical issues. Dr. Kathleen Allen, the book is Leading from the Roots. Thank you so much for being here. This has been a wonderful conversation. And thank you who are listening. You know, I noticed that got a note from Mary Milliner, who said, you know, play is child's work. That's a good one. She's joining us in from Charlotte, North Carolina. Mary Milliner, thank you for being on the program. Well, end of the program. It goes too quickly, but it's always a good time to be together. I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time.